Welcome everyone to our webinar, Is the Industry Greenwashing Aviation? My name is Anne Kretschmar, and I'm a campaigner with the network Stay Grounded, who has been organizing this webinar. It's co-hosted by Biofuelwatch and the Global Forest Coalition. Stay Grounded is a global network of around 180 member organizations that work for a just transport system and to rapidly reduce aviation in a just way. Biofuelwatch is a non-governmental organization based in the UK and the United States, which works to raise awareness on the negative impact of industrial biofuels and bioenergy. And the Global Forest Coalition is a coalition of NGOs and indigenous people organizations who are engaged in global policy debates related to forests, and they're both one of our long-standing members. We are very pleased about the great interest in this topic of greenwashing and the many participants that registered. And I'm very much looking forward to our inputs and the discussion today. I think right after the climate conference in Glasgow, we, as Stay Grounded, thought that it is a very good point to shed a light again on the often false green promises by industries and governments who distract from the real necessary changes. And yeah, this topic has gained more relevance now. It's also not a coincidence that we're holding this webinar simultaneously to the World Aviation Festival and the European Aviation Conference to take place today, as we don't really think it's time to celebrate aviation, but to reduce air traffic now. And we think it's time to use the COVID crisis as a chance for a just transition of the sector instead of going back to business as usual. As climate awareness is rising, we see that the pressure on fossil fuel industries is increasing, and this is also the case for aviation. Given that, the airlines and airports are keen to polish their reputations, especially after COVID-induced pause of aviation and the massive public bailouts. So when we walk around in the cities, I guess all of you have seen adverts for green or carbon neutral flying everywhere, and some of them even giving the impression that you do something good to the environment and climate when you fly. So yeah, greenwashing, that's actually misleading claims about environmental practices of organizations or governments. We'll hear more about that in an input later. And there was a study 2021 that investigated the communication of 37 airlines on carbon offsetting, and came to the conclusion that over 44% of airlines' green claims actually mislead consumers. So we have really a big misleading of airlines in terms of their promises. And in the last years, we saw several legal cases against airlines having to remove their misleading adverts like KLM or Ryanair. And there's another study that shows that we find a lot of myths in the discourse around technical solutions for the climate impact of aviation. So we see it as very crucial to look behind those green curtains and analyze the promised technical solutions and measures on their real potential to reduce emissions and criticize those misleading practices. So yeah, I'm very happy to have this webinar here today and grateful for the participation of our expert speakers. We will start after my introduction with an input from Tony Smith, who is co-author of the draft working paper Integrated Framework to assess greenwashing, and how we can identify greenwashing from a scientific perspective. Then we'll continue with Finlay Asher presenting the new fact sheets published by Stay Grounded about different technological solutions proposed by the industry, and looking at what are the things that are being told about those solutions and what are missing bits in the official communication. Then we'll zoom in a bit closer into the whole issue with an input from Ines van Viscelli about a new biofuel refinery in Paraguay, to have a on the ground view. And following this, we want to broaden the view again and look at the market-based solutions that are proposed, with an input by Asha Folonton from the Tyndall Center for Climate Research. And finally, Stefan Gößling will close with presenting his research analysis of the industry's decarbonization plan and the challenges. Then I'm very much looking forward to the discussion with the panelists, and we'll also have some time for questions from the audience at the end. So we will start with an input from Tone Smith. She is an ecological economist and independent writer. She has been active with Stay Grounded for many years and was also involved in our conference and publication on degrowth of aviation. And today, I'm very happy to have her here as part of a research study group of the Climate Social Science Network, who are developing a framework to assess greenwashing. So Tone, please, the stage is yours for looking a bit at what is actually greenwashing and how can we identify it.
Yes, thank you very much, Anna, and thanks a lot for the invitation. Can you hear me? Well, yeah, good. Okay, so I will share my screen with you to show some slides. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to share some insight from a draft, a discussion paper, but a draft of a discussion paper on frameworks for assessing greenwashing that I was involved in together with under this network, Climate Social Science Network, based at Brown University in the US. And in particular, I worked within a working group on spinning climate change, the role of public relations in greenwashing. So in this working group, we have together for some months worked on this working paper called An Integrated Framework for Assessing Greenwashing. So it's important that the word assess is important here because, of course, there is already a lot of research that has been done in the field of greenwash, and not only scientists doing work on it, but also NGOs and even media, and also consumer organizations or advertisement regulators in various countries who have worked on this. So what we want to contribute here, the purpose of the whole exercise, is to make something to assess, a framework to assess claims. And so we want this to be applied. It's meant to be an applied tool. And more specifically, then what seems quite obvious is that it's meant to be able to be used for assessing an organization's claim for potential greenwashing, but also to have actors to avoid greenwashing. So some of the framework can also be used by actors themselves to check their own claims or advertisement, because there are also actors involved in greenwashing, as we will see, which might not really do it on purpose. Then we also hope this can promote discussions about transparency and accountability more broadly, and also inform the public about things or how they could be misled by false solution and pledges and claims. So we don't only focus on actually on business claims or corporate claims, but also on policy claims by governments and pledges. So this is kind of one of the new things that we try to bring to this body of work, is to not only focus on business as greenwashing, but also other actors. So just to start with a definition of greenwash. So because there are so many actors who've been working on this, and also researchers from so many different disciplines, from business and marketing studies to communication studies, but also social scientists or environmental management studies. Many different definitions exist depending on the field of interest. And as the area has evolved, definitions also change. So we see our work as
También lo hacen las definiciones. Y esperamos también que con este borrador podamos conseguir
so that it will develop along the way. So that is our aim, to continue to update it. But the definition that we currently use, so our working definition, is the following. Greenwashing is an umbrella term for a variety of misleading communications and practices that intentionally or not induce false positive perceptions of an organization's environmental performance. So as you see, we point out this that both intentional and non-intentional claims can be greenwashing. Further, we also include other actors other than businesses, as I just said. Although, I mean, this body of knowledge has also increased a lot with all the focus on corporate social responsibility. So that is one of the fields of research that is contributing to a constant growing of this body of knowledge and changing of the definitions as well. And finally, even though in the definition we have environmental performance as a kind of the criteria, we also bring in social aspects sometimes, the integration between the social and the environmental in some of our assessment criteria. So in 10 minutes, it's very hard to present this whole framework. So I'm just going to give you a few tasters, but this is kind of the overall framework structure. We have identified 14 different themes of kinds of greenwash. So these 14 labels here are meant to point to different kinds of greenwash, and they can be also sorted by those three categories on the left, as you see. So the first 6 relate to impact, so that means whether the claim is real. Then the next 4 is more about alignment between different kinds of claims. So it could be in a government's, on the one hand, pledging or signing up to the Paris Agreement and giving pledges, while on the other hand, having an energy and oil policy not at all in line. And finally, the 4 last ones are about communication, the accurateness in the communication. So just to point out a couple. So the first one, which is about hidden trade-offs and selective disclosure, could be about organizations or companies who highlight some positive aspects of a product, but don't mention other aspects, which are the real problematic one. They could be things like point number 4, that the claims are just bluntly irrelevant, often because there is already environmental law in place that obliges them to act in this way. So then to highlight that we do this is not so relevant. Then there are plain lies, number 5, but many of these are not plain lies that one can really prove. So it's more degrees of inaccuracy or lying. So I will briefly look at a few. How do we use this? Maybe I can show 3 examples, but Qatar Airways will be the first. So just to show how you would proceed if you use the framework. You find a potential greenwash claim, then check it against the list of indicated questions in the framework. So as I just showed you, we have 14 themes, but each of these themes can have 1 or several indicated questions. So these questions are meant to guide you in assessing the claim. And then finally, if you answer yes to the questions, then you get the result of the assessment, and you can, the result will be whether there is no greenwash, likely greenwash, or obvious greenwash. So the Qatar Airways example I want to use is from this category called skeleton in the closet. You might have seen this, this ad text which stated Qatar Airways fly greener at the European Football Championship, I think it was, in the semi-final. This was on the advertisement boards around the football arena. Now, here is the indicator question, which you could use to, if you answer yes to this question, then the assessment is that yes, this is a greenwashing claim. And I will not read the whole thing, I don't have time, but if we look at the point, part number B of this indicator question, that it can lead consumers to confusion about the comparison, this is the point here. So Qatar Airways fly greener than what? What is the comparison? Is it greener than other companies? Greener than what they have previously done? Plus, there's the skeleton in the closet aspect that the core product or the core business activity of this company is not a green kind of business, which makes it irrelevant maybe to point out some small achievement at the edge. So the answer to this question would be yes, equals greenwash. Okay, quickly, just two more examples. I'll take an example of a government and of a NGO. So Australia has spent climate funds on researching and upgrading to clean coal, as they call it. And this involves trying to improve the efficiency of coal burning. But of course, even if you burn coal at 100% efficiency, it will not be clean in the sense that it will actually emit CO2. So this is just not credible, falls under the category just not credible, after having asked this question, which I will not read out in full detail because of time limits. And the third example, which is WWF, which is an example of a co-opted endorsement, which is about when claims that greenwash organizations' activities are actually endorsed by NGOs or national agencies. And in this case, WWF has actually been accused of forging links with global corporations. And one of the corporations is KLM, which I am not sure that whether they actually still have this cooperation agreement, but they were, since in 2007, they started a cooperation agreement with KLM, which then gave KLM the impression of being a green company. Okay, so I think I used some of my time. Thank you very much for your attention. And yeah, we can discuss this more afterwards.
Great, thank you very much, Torne, for this insight in your work. I think it's really important, and I'm very happy you're working on this, and we have this framework now to assess greenwashing. I think it's really important on the one hand side to also look at governments and not only on organizations. And for our work, when examining like false green claims, it's of course very important to have a scientific basis also for criticizing greenwashing, that we can prove in a way that this is actually really greenwashing. So thank you very much for your input, and also for this work. I think we can find a lot of those examples in the aviation industry. So for the next input, I will hand over to Finlay Asher. He's a former aerospace engineer, now active in the climate justice movement, also at Stay Grounded and with Safe Landing, a group of climate concerned former or current aviation workers who are pushing for just transition solutions for the sector. He's co-author of our fact sheet series and creates informative videos on the topic on his YouTube channel, Green Sky Thinking. And he will present our new fact sheets and give a bit of his perspectives on the new technological solutions that are proposed. And yeah, probably when in our greenwashing working group we're continuing with our work, I'm sure the framework that Torne just presented will help us to identify even more greenwashing facts But for now, we have those fact sheets, and I'm looking forward for your presentation, Finley.
Thank you, Anna. So as you were saying, I'm Finley. I used to work at Rolls-Royce designing future aircraft engine concepts with Boeing and Airbus. I was looking at things like hybrid electric propulsion, future aircraft engines, jet engines, a bit more electric, different aircraft configurations. So I've got quite a good idea about the technology that will emerge over the next 10 to 20 years. And when I was in the company, I saw that there was a very different story being told between the engineers that were looking at the physics compared to what the leaders of our company were saying in the public and in the media. And that's part of why I quit my job and I founded this group, and why I was so happy to be involved with Stay Grounded to set some of these facts out within these fact sheets. So the fact sheets, there's 5 of them. They're available at the hyperlink that you can see here, staygrounded.org/greenwashing. There's 5 fact sheets in total that we've been releasing over the last month. The first is on efficiency, aircraft engine efficiency, conventional aircraft efficiency. So fuel burn getting better each year. The second is electric aircraft, electric flight. The third one is on hydrogen. The fourth is on biofuels. And the fifth is on electro fuels or e-fuels. So I'm going to take you through each of those now. What I'd encourage you to do is go to that link afterwards if you've not had a look, and have a look through the fact sheets in your own time, because there's a lot more detail than I can cover in 10 minutes. And I'm just going to give you some of the killer high-level points on each of those to give you a flavor. But please go and explore those in more time, and send us any messages you've got if you've got any questions or any feedback. So the first one is aircraft efficiency. Now, aircraft efficiency comes from more aerodynamic aircraft, lighter materials so the aircraft weighs less, and improved engine design. So the stuff I was working on, making the engines bigger, making the core of the engine hotter and higher pressure. All of those things improve efficiency, which means the amount of fuel you burn per passenger kilometer moved, and in turn, the amount of emissions you produce per passenger kilometer moved. Now, the problem with this is on the left-hand side, we've got air traffic and fuel efficiency. And the light blue line, which relates to the right y-axis, so this is the last 50 years, 1970 to 2020, there's been a reduction in kilograms of CO2 per kilometer traveled. So aircraft have been getting more efficient, and that has been reducing with time. And that's good. And that's what the industry like to highlight. But what they don't like to talk about as much is this massive growth, the yellow line, in air traffic. And that's on the left-hand side of the y-axis. So you can see trillion passenger kilometers has gone from less than 1 trillion in 50 years ago to almost 9 trillion in 2020 before COVID happened. And what that's meant is, despite the efficiency improvement, on the right-hand side, we've got CO2 growth and CO2 emissions produced every year. And that's just been increasing rapidly, pretty much in line with the air traffic growth. And actually, efficiency improvements mean that it's cheaper to fly and people can more afford to fly, and then they do fly more. And actually, it might be sort of supercharging the growth of CO2 emissions. So this is what happens if you don't constrain how much you fly. There's no restrictions, and we just keep on making it cheaper and cheaper, and more people fly further and more frequently. So historically, aircraft efficiency improvements have led to total emissions increasing and not decreasing. So it's just sensible to say the same thing will continue to happen into the future, unless we have some way of constraining air traffic growth, so restricting how much we can fly in the future. We should expect that after COVID, we'll see a dip, and the industry is expecting in 3-4 years to return to 2019 levels of flying, and then get back on the same trajectory of growth that it was on over the last 10 years. So this is aircraft efficiency by itself, without restricting air traffic, will just lead to emissions continuing to increase. okay, so maybe we need to move to a different type of technology that doesn't burn jet fuel. So how about electric flight? So electric batteries powering electric motors. That should produce like 0 emissions during operation, just like an electric car. So the first problem is because of the weight of batteries and the fact that when you discharge a battery, it doesn't reduce in weight, like jet fuel burns off and the aircraft gets lighter. That doesn't happen with the battery, and batteries are super heavy. So it really means that just the physics mean that this will only really be possible for really small aircraft. So maybe 10 passengers flying for very short distance. So let's say 1 hour, maybe 2 hours at best, but for a tiny aircraft. So when you start to look at those ranges, in most cases, if you can't fly very far, you can't go across the Atlantic or the Pacific. Maybe you're flying within Europe, and there's ground transport options, so a coach or a train. And that is a far more efficient use of our limited renewable energy than flying, because you take off and climb into the sky, that's very energy intensive. And it's always more efficient to stay on the ground as long as you can put in more people, as long as you don't have people driving around, 1 person per car. It's far more efficient to put people in a coach or a train, and that's what we should be incentivizing. So really, yeah, that just to illustrate the issue that we've got, batteries are about 40 to 50 times worse than jet fuel on a weight basis. For the same amount of energy, they're about 45 times worse. Now, an electric motor is about twice the efficiency of a jet engine. So rather than 40, 50, you're looking at more like 1 to 25, but it's still 25 times worse. So there's a long way to go before we improve battery technology to the point where it's competitive and where we'll see aircraft of a similar size. Okay, so batteries aren't really going to cut it. Well, what about hydrogen? And Airbus in particular have been showing concepts of hydrogen aircraft. Now, the good thing about hydrogen is that on a weight basis, it looks really good. So as I was saying, batteries are, in 1 kilogram of batteries, you've got less than 1 megajoule of energy. For jet fuel, it's about 40, 50 times better than that. Hydrogen is 3 times better than jet fuel, just on a mass basis. So it looks good on mass, but the problem with hydrogen is volume. So 1 liter of hydrogen contains 1/4 of the energy of 1 liter of jet fuel. So really you need 4 times the amount of volume of hydrogen. And this is liquid hydrogen, which means it's extra energy intensive to make. You have to compress it and cool it down to minus 250 degrees C, cryogenic temperatures, to get it as dense as possible. And even then, with a very difficult to design storage tank, it's still 4 times the size. So what this does is it increases the weight and the volume of the aircraft, which is bad if you're designing an aircraft. Why is it bad? Well, it means either you have the same number of passengers, but you increase the size of the aircraft and add fuel tanks in the fuselage. That increases the drag of the aircraft, which is bad for efficiency, and it increases the weight, which is also bad. The other option you have, you can get rid of passengers and put the fuel tanks where the passengers are. But then obviously you've got a lot less passengers and cargo, and you can make less money, and you have to fly more aircraft to deliver the same number of passengers. So just as a summary on hydrogen, it's possible, but these physical constraints mean that also it'll be much smaller aircraft flying much shorter distances. So medium aircraft, medium distance at best. Also, the biggest thing really with hydrogen is the timescales. So we're looking at 15 to 20 years to develop and certify these aircraft. We will have blown our carbon budget for 1.5 degrees C by then, and that will just be 1 aircraft. We have to completely update the fleet, and really we're looking at the 2050s, 2060s by that time, and to update all of the infrastructure. So really this is a great solution perhaps for 30, 40 years time, but it doesn't stop us looking at the policies we need this decade. The next thing is it does need completely different infrastructure. So we need to redesign our airports, and we're not building them in the right way just now. We're still building airports based on these long haul jet airlines. also huge amounts of energy required to make hydrogen, and we just don't have that much renewable energy to spare. And I'll get onto that in a second when we discuss e-fuels. So just looking at the timescales, this is a bucket animation. The bucket represents our atmosphere on Earth, and we've been filling our atmosphere up with carbon for the last 200 years. And every year we put more and more in each year, and we're accelerating towards the top of the bucket and blowing our carbon budget. So we've got less than 10 years left at current levels of emissions before we blow the budget. So we have to think on those timescales when we're looking at solutions. So, okay, so if we don't have the time, and also there's physical constraints on battery and hydrogen, what about alternative jet fuels? So the same physical characteristics as jet fuel, and these, you might have heard of these sustainable aviation fuels. And the idea with these is that the problem with fossil fuels is we're taking carbon that's been stored deep underground and is out of the atmosphere. We're digging it up, we're processing it into a fuel, putting it into a car or a power station or an aircraft. Those emit greenhouse gases when we burn them. So CO2 is going into the atmosphere, and the concentrations are increasing every year because we're taking it from deep underground, putting it in the atmosphere. The idea with these sustainable aviation fuels is we take carbon already in the atmosphere and the biosphere. So the first thing is we can grow biofuels, so trees or crops, and convert those into a fuel. We can also take water and use a process called electrolysis to make hydrogen. And the other thing we can do is we can industrially suck carbon out of the air and filter it out of the air to get CO2. And we can combine the CO2 with the hydrogen to make a hydrocarbon alternative fuel. And if we power these processes with renewable energy as well, then theoretically, this could be low or zero carbon theoretically. But let's look at what that actually is in practice. So the first one is these synthetic electrofuels or e-fuels. So the idea is you take electrical energy, you do this process called electrolysis that converts water into hydrogen. So water is H2O. You separate it from the oxygen and you get pure hydrogen, very energy intensive. You've then got carbon capture processes such as direct air capture that filter carbon from the sky, again, very energy intensive as well. You then refine those via various chemical processes, again, energy intensive, and you get this e-fuel that you can put in an aircraft. So all of these energy intensive processes mean lots of energy required, and that's bad. How bad is it? Well, it's very bad. So if you have, this is a graph from the Committee on Climate Change from the UK, and it shows if you've got 1 unit of electricity, where should you use it to get the maximum amount of CO2 reduction? So the best thing you can do is displace coal power generation because of how bad the emissions are there. The next thing you can do is power an electrical vehicle on the ground. That's very efficient use of the energy, and displace petrol or diesel and get a big emission saving. The next thing is to power a heat pump in your house to get rid of a gas boiler. The next thing to do is to displace gas generation on the grid. The next one is to power direct air capture, the process we looked at earlier for capturing carbon and just storing it. And then producing hydrogen, because it's really energy intensive to replace a gas boiler, is another one. But the worst thing we can do pretty much is to produce synthetic jet fuel. So lots of energy required and barely any tons of CO2 per unit of energy. So it's literally one of the most wasteful uses of renewable energy we've got. So just as a comparison here, just for our current levels of jet fuel, we need roughly 2.5 times the renewable energy currently generated globally today just for aviation. And that's not even really looking at growth of aviation as well. So, okay, so if we don't have the renewable energy, where else can we look? Well, the industry is very keen to look at biofuels. And the idea is with biofuels is you grow some crops, that captures carbon from the air in the plant. You then process that into a fuel, burn that in a car, and then the emissions go into the atmosphere, but are then recaptured by the biomass. And this is great. This looks great theoretically, the circle of life, they like to call it. So I'm going to say this is actually the circle of strife. And you'll hear more later from people elsewhere about the effects of this and the damaging environmental impacts. But just on the technical side, this is a picture from our fact sheet on biofuels, and it shows a study from Transport and Environment, and relative to fossil fuel, actually, if we grow crops, and a lot of the danger that we will just use crops for these fuels, they're 20% worse, 2 times worse for soy, and palm oil is the absolute worst, 3 times worse. So in all of these cases, we would have been better burning fossil fuel. And this is because of the land use change emissions. Often this leads to deforestation, drainage of peat bogs, actually destroys biodiversity, and the emissions from that are worse than actually potentially just burning fossil fuel. So if we don't have, we can't scale crops sustainably because of land and water resources and leading to deforestation, the industry really likes talking about fuel from waste. So household waste, like collection in the city, and we just can't scale these things enough to produce enough jet fuel for aviation. And then they also look at agricultural waste, so waste from farms. And again, it's very difficult to scale these things and without also removing carbon from soil. And it's really important that we keep carbon in the soil because that's a great carbon sink as well. And importantly, these waste sources, they're really small, but also we need them for other things. So agricultural waste, we could use that for organic fertilizer to stop fossil fuel fertilizer use on farms. So yeah, the conclusion really is we should not be looking at biofuels and they're a false solution, and we will get more detail on that from the other speakers. So I think that's me, and I'll move on to the next person. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Finlay, for shedding light on those different technical solutions that are proposed and looking at the shortfalls and at all the things that are mostly not told from the industry or also governments when we talk about those great new solutions. I think it's important to say that that this is not about saying we shouldn't have any technical development or technological improvements. It's not about a bashing of technology, but it's about saying those technologies will not save us, and the claim that they will actually lead us to zero emission flying in the time that that we need to reduce emissions to stay within 1.5 limits, this claim is wrong and it's not going to work. So I think that's a very important distinction to make also from our point of view from Stay Grounded, that we say, well, this claim is wrong and we actually will probably need to reduce emissions. But I think we get, reduce flights, I'm sorry. But I think we'll get to that later on. Now as I said, we want to zoom in a little bit on the more specific topic of biofuels. And I'm happy to have our co-hosts here from Biofuelwatch. Gary Hughes works with Biofuelwatch in the United States and is also part of our working group on greenwashing, and will say some intro words before Ines Franticelli is speaking. And she's a researcher and campaigner at Hanoi, which is dedicated, and she's dedicated to issues related to land disputes, agribusiness, and human rights violations. And she's co-author of a new case study on the omega green biokerosene plantation in Paraguay, which we will now hear a bit more about. But first, I want to give the word to Gary to say 2 sentences about Biofuelwatch and their work.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you to everyone who is here for this fascinating webinar. Great appreciations to, again, Anne and Mida for really driving the event, to all the presenters, to Finlay. My name is Gary Hughes, and I work with Biofuelwatch. I'm based on unceded Ohlone territory in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. And I've been working on a portfolio of issues, including this question of sustainable aviation fuels. My colleague and really mentor, Almuth Ernstein, who's also here, really wanted me to make sure that we are naming names. As I try to take just a brief moment to set the scene for Ines and her report on the Omega Green refinery in Paraguay. One of the companies that we're really identifying that is embarking on a massive greenwash campaign around sustainable aviation fuels is Shell. There's many legacy oil refiners that are trying to take advantage of this moment to breathe air into their failed dirty energy model. And we've found that Shell in particular, for instance, here in the Western states of the US, they've signed a product offload agreement with a company called Red Rock Biofuels that claims to be able to make aviation biofuels from woody biomass. They've received hundreds of millions of dollars of public money and have never yet produced even 1 gallon of fuel. So we basically consider all of the promotion of making liquid fuels from woody biomass as being a unicorn purely in the category of greenwash. We also really want to raise the alarms that Shell has just announced plans to start producing large quantities of biofuels, including for aviation in Singapore. We know that Singapore lies at the heart of the global palm oil market. Shell's also signed an aviation biofuels agreement with the Finnish oil and biofuel company Neste, which is also very linked to destruction of forests from palm oil. And then really importantly, Shell has signed a contract to purchase a total of 2.5 billion liters of aviation biofuels over a 5-year period from a refinery sourcing soya and animal fats. This is the Omega Green refinery. So before I pass this over to Ines, though, I also want to say that here in the San Francisco Bay Area, we are dealing with the proposed conversion of 2 oil refineries to processing largely soy-based renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel. And one thing that I really hope that we all take home from this discussion as well, as much as we want to focus on the land sector impacts and the deforestation, are the human impacts for the people that live next to these industrial facilities, that live next to these refineries, and understand how profound the environmental racism really is when we see how marginalized many of these communities that live next to these facilities are. So I think Ines will help elevate this human dynamic that needs so much attention. So it's really an honor for me to be here supporting Stay Grounded as representative of Biofuelwatch and also very close to Global Forest Coalition. So I'd like to hand it over to Ines now. Thank you so much.
Muchísimas gracias, Gary. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Gary Hughes. Thank you, and thank you everybody, all of you that are here today with us. I come from Paraguay, and it's a country from the global south. I think that this is a great opportunity, given that most of you in this webinar are people coming from the global north and people that come from countries that consume the most and therefore contribute more to the tragedy that we're suffering, the humanity. My country is in the south and is a country that, due to the global economy, is being left behind. That's why I'm very thankful for these comments and Philip, Gary, because you told us, you were sharing your comments about this type of businesses, companies that don't have an environmental face, but also a social face, a social impact. When we talk about this consumption, we also talk about the lives of people, the bodies of people, and the hopes of these people from the South. After this introduction, I would like to say hello to all of you who are here today. The case I will present today is about the Omega Green project, a biofuel refinery being built in Paraguay, a South African country characterized by its tropical forest and abundance of water. Today, it is devastated by monocultures of soybean and transgenic corn, eucalyptus, and cows. This production has been imposed on us by transnational companies that take the income and leave us with destruction, waste, and disease. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Mega Green is an investment of $800 million, and this is the largest private investment in the history of the country, and will be built on a 70-hectare site in the city of Villeta, which is located just 45 kilometers from the capital of the country, close to the Paraguay River. And this river has one of the most important basins in South America. And in Villeta, the installation of warehouses and private ports belonging to companies related to this extractive production is growing more and more. So Omega Green's neighbors are dedicated to agribusiness, such as the American companies ADM or Mosaic, among others. This proximity of the transit of chemicals in Paraguay River has a serious impact. Next slide, please, now. Thank you. And this has a serious impact on the functionality of the basin and on the availability of water for the entire population that is supplied by aid. In this case, Omega Green in particular, the most affected population devotes to fishing, and they say that they have no work today because there are no more fishes in this area of the river. Next slide now, please. Thank you. Omega Green belongs to the Ecb Group, which is a Brazilian company that has been producing biofuels since 2005. And they have been denounced because they have benefited from deals in alliance with Petrobras, which is Brazil's public fuel company. And when I mean denounce, I mean there are open legal processes against them. ECB are the initials of the owner of this business group, Erasmo Carlos Baristella, who likes to be photographed with politicians such as Jair Bolsonaro or Mario Abdo Benitez, who is the current president of Paraguay. I prefer not to comment what they think about this environmental crisis. Next slide, please. Thank you. This project foresees the use of 2,400 tons of raw material per day, including transgenic soybeans and animal fats. Transgenic soy currently occupies 68% of the total cultivated area, and it deforests, degrades the soil, pollutes, and expels population. It also impoverishes and sickens the peasants and indigenous population as well. In my country, where the 60 million of agrotoxins are consumed every year. So we have direct deaths due to this issue in our population. When Gary and Finlay too were talking about extracting coal from the soil, I would like to add that some parts of this soil is no longer available for production, and my country suffers from a serious lack of food sovereignty. So we are not able to produce enough food to feed our entire population, and that's the consequence of the loss of soil, of ground, because that was just for the production of the global north. And now we can move on to the next slide, please. Animal fats used by Omega Green come from the sustained expansion of cattle production in the Paraguayan Chaco, which suffers from the largest deforestation in the world, especially in the territory of the Ayurveda people. And these people continue to resist to this day in voluntary isolation. And they provide food to the world. However, our population is eating less quality food, and the rest of the food that cannot be exported because they are exported the high quality materials for other countries and they do not stay here. We can move on to the next slide, please. The plant will have a total production capacity of 20,000 barrels per day of biofuels, including SPK, synthetic paraffinic kerosene, also known as sustainable aviation fuel. And this demand in Paraguay is really low. The production already has destinations, and the company has signed contracts with British Petroleum for the supply of 1 billion liters per year, starting in 2024, and also with the Anglo-Dutch Shell for more than 2.5 billion liters of renewable fuels for a period of 5 years. This contract, in Batistella's own words, ensures the demand for 50% of the biorefinery's capacity.
There is an agreement with the Frank area that will be given an extension to different type of tributes and it will be given the possibility of return without any cost. The contract, it is around 5 years. It is a governance concession in return of probably around 2,000 employees. The impact, the economical impact, will be only beneficial for those companies, that it will not benefit my country. Next slide, please. As a conclusion, the biofuels are only satisfying a very small minority. It is, and as a consequence, is creating big social problems. Omega Green, just as a big project, it is only bringing more destruction, pain in my country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ines, for giving your perspective and telling us about this devastating project. And I think it's really an important part of this looking at the greenwashing and those so-called solutions. And I'm very happy you brought in this Global South perspective, because here we see that as the Global North countries who already contributed so much to the climate crisis, we saw it in this bucket animation that Finlay showed before, which in the first place will harm Global South countries, now are coming up with so-called solutions that again harm the people in those countries. And so I think this is a very important point to notice when we talk about those solutions. so-called solutions, because they're actually not solutions, but again, harming people and actually, as we also saw before, not really even solving the problem of the climate impact of aviation. So thank you very much, Ines, for this insight and for your perspective. And we might go back to that later in the panel discussion. Now I'm happy to go on to our next speaker, Asha Fullerton. And you probably noticed that in the fact sheets we touched so far mainly the technological aspects of the green solutions. And in former publication of ours, like the report on green flying, we also looked quite critical on the so-called market-based solutions and especially on offsetting schemes. And as the new fact sheets on this are still in the making, I'm very happy to have Asha with us now, who will go a bit deeper into those questions of market-based mechanisms and offsetting and the policies that are discussed for aviation here and the possible loopholes that we find in there. Asha is a research associate at the Tyndall Center for Climate Research and is currently working on a project on exploring the barriers and opportunities of sustainable fuels in freight and the aviation sector. And yeah, I'm very happy to have you here and looking forward to your input.
Thank you, Anne. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Can I just give a quick thumbs up and say that it's all working?
Not yet.
Oh.
Maybe just unshare and share again.
Okay. No? That's weird. Are you not able to see it at all?
Just a black screen.
Ah.
Maybe Mira, do you want to try?
Yeah, maybe. If that could work.
Yes, just give me a second, please.
I was actually not able to see Inez's presentation, so it actually might be my system. Yeah.
We'll sort it out. We have your presentation.
No problem. I am not able to see this from my end.
Can others see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Oh, that's so strange.
So can you maybe just look at your presentation from your screen? Yes. And then
I will do that.
I think you can just tell me how to pass on, go on.
All right. Well, my presentation is more focused on, like Anne said, market-based mechanisms. And I specifically want to go back and look at a little bit of what polluter pays principle actually means in today's day and age, and whether we're actually holding the aviation industry accountable for the pollution, that they've caused. So polluter pays, so if we could go to the next slide. Thanks. Polluter pays principle was defined back in 1992, and the way that it has evolved is, in a lot of different ways, but the way that we see today is more like market-based mechanisms. Originally, it was set as a legal term in environmental law that holds the polluters accountable, but in today's day and age, we refer to them as market-based mechanisms. And under the market-based mechanisms, there are various ways in which any specific jurisdiction or a country can implement an MBM to target more ambitious reductions. And, that's in theory. And these are the three kinds of MBMs that are out there right now, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means. There are other fuel markets out there in North America, but majority of the MBMs that are in various countries will fall into the category of a carbon tax, an ETS, or an offset program. Moving to the next slide. Okay. So the UK has chosen two different MBMs that cover the aviation industry. The first is the UK ETS. It currently covers only a third of the UK national emissions, and this is including the aviation industry, which is currently capped at 155 million metric tons for 2021. And the way the emission trading systems work is that there is a total cap, and each year that declines by a certain percentage or value, and with the end goal in mind. So this program specifically will decline by 4.2 million metric tons of CO2 per annum. And when you isolate the aviation industry, that covers flights between the UK area and the UK outbound flights to the European Economic Area. And that makes up about 111 airline operators that are covered under the program. And each of these operators are actually allowed are given allowances for free to begin with, because to prevent carbon leakage. And that essentially means that, you know, there's a fear that businesses will uproot from a jurisdiction that has a regulation to a jurisdiction that doesn't have any regulation. And so to prevent that, they're provided with free allowances to get started, and that reduces in correspondence with the declining cap. Next slide, please. Thanks. So the other program that covers international aviation emissions, and that was domestic. The ETS is domestic and partly international, but CORSIA is one of the first mechanisms that covers international aviation emissions, and it is an offsetting scheme. So there is a baseline emissions level that aviation industry has to meet beyond 2020, including 2020 and beyond. And that currently covers about 60 to 70% of global travel activity. And I've put the range in there because it would really depend on how many industry participants actually volunteer at the end of the pilot phase and the first phase. And just to keep one thing in mind, the voluntary phase ends for most Annex 1 countries in 2027. And beyond that, it becomes a mandated program for Annex 1 countries. So essentially, UK will be participating from start to finish. So the governing body, the International Civil Aviation Organization, has existing criteria in which they measure the performance of eligible offset units. So if there are certain programs and projects that don't meet this current standard, they're not eligible for CORSIA, but there are so many inherent problems with that, which we'll come to later. And these projects currently can be based in any country, so there's no geographical limitation. So it could be in the global north and the global south. And again, we'll touch on that in a little bit later. One of the key developments that happened in the last year as a result of COVID in 2020 was originally the idea was to take the baseline emissions average it out for 2019 and 2020. But after a lot of discussion, the aviation industry lobbying, 2019 baseline was actually agreed upon, and that would allow the aviation industry to pollute 30% more than they would have if they had gone with an average of 2019 and 2020. Next slide, please. So, so why do I think this is troubling? Well, for many reasons. I think, I'll break down the specific programs in the next couple of slides, but just to talk about market-based mechanisms as a whole, I think historically industry has always favored these because it's always been cheaper to pollute than to decarbonize. And that is very troubling because in this graph, as you can see, the area that is shaded in dark pink and then light pink that transitions into light pink, that is all market-based mechanisms, and that transitions into carbon removal technologies by mid-2030s. And that is immensely impractical. And the proportion of emissions that rely on MBMs, they're significant. They're significant until mid-2030s when it transitions into CDR, which is another there are a myriad of problems that have not been addressed with CDR or tech yet, and then at the scale that we need. And so the idea to show the slide was, that industry have a very different perspective for how they rely on MBNs. And that's purely because there are cheap offset credits and cheap allowances out there that that gives them permission to pollute and get away with it. There is no real incentive there for them to decarbonize. And if you want real decarbonization, and I'm not even talking about future emissions, I'm talking about current emissions. If you want decarbonization now, there has to be a convergence of cost of decarbonization and the cost of carbon offsets. They have to at some point meet in order for aviation industry to choose to decarbonize as opposed to pollute more. Right? But industry has always pushed for these market-based mechanisms because it's just an easy way out. Next slide, please. So if I further break down the sort of a little bit of the loopholes within the UK ETS, and we'll get to CORSIA in a second, a lot of the UK share of international aviations is not actually covered within this program. And this graph really shows the proportion between the UK surrender to ETS, which are the blue bars, and the UK share of international emissions, which are the orange bars. That's the majority, that's a chunk of emissions that are actually not really accountable and under any program. And I know CORSIA is obviously responsible for international aviations, but we're really chalking up a very big majority of the UK's international emissions to a program that hasn't really materialized the way that we envisioned it to. And so if the UK wants to actually meet its 6 carbon budget, which includes the international aviation emissions, then the ETS, which likely seems to be more successful than CORSIA, has to cover or expand its coverage into UK's international aviation emissions. The other big sort of feature of any ETS around the world is the funds that are collected at the end of this program, or even during this program. What is being done to the UK ETS funds that are collected? There's currently no directive or transparency from BEIS or the UK government as to what is happening with these funds at the moment. And there are various ways in which these can be used, if not mandated. And in fact, they can be used for more carbon intensive activities, which we really don't want, because that is entirely counterproductive, right? So there has to be it has to be mandated. There has to be a list of conditions as to how this pool of money can be spent, either investment in newer technologies, or even research and development, or even opening up a channel for climate financing to lower income countries. So that is also a possibility. The next slide, please. So this is my last slide, and I wanted to focus a little bit more on CORSIA. Having worked in the offset market, and anybody who's familiar with voluntary offsets knows that, offset, the concept of offsets in general has a myriad of problems, and CORSIA has had a lot of those problems since its inception. But there's also CORSIA specific problems that we have to address. One of the big issues that I find troubling and frankly dangerous is that there is currently no methodology that tells us if I buy an offset credit, whether I would be able to claim it or the country where the project is able to claim it. So there is no methodology for this now, and this is not a new issue that has plagued CORSIA. This has happened before, it's happening now, and there's going to be a reassessment in 2022 to see whether any of these programs are actually addressing this problem. And till today, not every program has been. So that is a huge issue. The other issue is that ICAO has this eligibility criteria that addresses some of the logistical and operational factors of offsets, but we're entirely ignoring the sociocultural impacts of offsets and the kind of destruction that they can cause, especially in the global south. Some of my colleagues went to COP26 and they were able to hear all these stories, and we just don't have those conversations at the high level. So right now we are asking the wrong questions. We're asking how we can implement offsets. The question is, who are we implementing offsets for? Who are the beneficiaries of these programs if we choose to go ahead with it, right? And so we're kind of missing an entire aspect of mitigation and sort of saying that we're doing it for the sake of decarbonization, but we're not really meeting the right metrics while doing this. My other point actually connects to that, is that... Sorry, was that? All right, I'll just continue. My other point actually relates to that. So if a project is set up in the global south versus whether it's the global north, are we valuing the project the same way? If 1 ton of CO2 in the UK equals 1 ton of CO2 in India or any other country, Indonesia, it could be Malaysia, are we valuing it the same way? There are immense socioeconomic inequities by assuming that, you know, the offset project is going to be cheaper in India than there are going to be in Canada or UK. So there has to be a way where we can standardize pricing for offsets. You know, if countries choose to implement this, then it's very important that we address this. So all this to really say that, you know, the cost of carbon should really be appropriate, because the idea is to incentivize decarbonization and not pollution, right? And currently, as we stand, market-based mechanisms are not really promoting mitigation because they're not addressing very key environmental and social pillars. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand it over to you, Anne. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Asha, for this, exploring the...
Muchísimas gracias, Asha.
The shortfalls of Corsia and other market-based solutions. I think, the problem that it's simply not fair that aviation is in many ways unjust is one of the central topics that we have. And I mean, at Stay Grounded ourselves, we're not even looking at improving Corsia, but actually think it's probably beyond repair, but we need other solutions than those. And as you also said, all of those measures don't really include the possibility of reducing demand or actually reducing flights. And I think that's one of the main problems, that this possibility never comes up when discussing any solutions to reduce the impact of aviation. So to go more into this topic, I'm happy now to go on to our final speaker, Stefan Gößling, who is professor at Linnaeus and Lund University and long-term researcher on the intersection of tourism, transport, and sustainability. And his work on aviation, his analysis of the industry's promises, as well as his suggestions and calculations for alternative measures, have been always very important for our analysis. And I'm looking forward to his comments on the current decarbonization plans of the industry.
My pleasure. Hello, everyone. Could you provide me with access to the sharing function, please? Because it seems to be blocked at the moment. Yes, that looks better. No, that is not me. All right. I can share my screen. Sorry, guys. I'm not sure what's happened here in the meantime.
Shall I do it?
Yeah, please do.
So here we go. Sorry for the technical.
So this is a wrong title. Go right to the next slide, please. It's 104, so I'll make this quick. Look, I was asked to talk a little bit about technology and demand changes, demand change policies, and technical barriers of synfuels, which is covering a lot of ground. But I'll try to summarize what the state of the art is on these topics. And the graph you're seeing here, you're not really expected to understand. It's from the most recent research that we've just submitted into the behavior of people, because essentially that's been a major focus in recent campaigns, that it has been argued that it's the individual, the consumer, who should make the right decisions. And as a consumer, you have essentially 4 options of reacting, and that is shown on the right-hand side here. You can avoid flight, you can substitute flights with other transport modes or video conferencing. You can choose low emission flights, try to be more environmentally friendly in your choice, or you could purchase carbon offsets as the only way out if you have to take a flight, because that at the moment is the only thing we can do. And all of this is embedded in different aspects here in what we call aspects that are framing the decisions from the outside, which is, for instance, the price that people have to pay for the different choices, but it's also embedded in social norms and attitudes, and that steers then how people decide to either perhaps forego a flight or to engage with any of the other choices. The sad news of all of this is perhaps that the only viable option that seems to really work in order to influence behavior is taxation. There is now some research that shows that if you introduce a tax on aviation, demand will go down, and most importantly, perhaps it's most efficient from what we can observe in terms of effects when it comes to low-cost carriers. As soon as you put even a modest tax on low-cost carriers, essentially the propensity, the interest of people to fly with low-cost carriers will decline right away. So it's a matter of the level of taxation. And everything else, not really. Probably this forum is a number of hardcore people who would really abstain from flying, but for most people that's just not an option. And some scary information, I also just saw the latest study on the perceptions and attitudes of youth to environmental issues in Germany, which is a representative study for the 14 to 29-year-olds, and just 35% of that population is supporting a ban on short-haul flights, which is really not an issue for them. And it struck me when I saw that study yesterday that we have lost the support of the very young people for even very essential things when it comes to flying, such as to ban short-haul flights, which should be a no-brainer really, because it's just not necessary to have that kind of thing. But it tells us something about how young people perceive the government, the strong government, as an infringement on their rights and their future ideas and lifestyles, and perhaps how they would weigh different issues into this than we currently consider. So I think what we need to do is to think a little bit bigger about climate change, and this is in the next picture. I talked a bit about the consumer, which is in this model the person who makes a decision or not. On the left-hand side, here called the consumer citizen, because there's an important distinction here. You are not always just a consumer who makes a decision whether I should or should not buy something, but who is also a citizen who might make a decision politically in regard to what should be possible to buy or not buy for everyone. And that's very important, because many of us are not willing to not fly as individuals when everybody else does it. But as citizens, we are willing to support policies that will make that harder for everyone. So it's very important to remember this distinction of consumer citizen, because there's a lot of citizen support for policies that would really have consequences for the environmental sustainability of aviation. The consumer citizen, again, is part of society. You're an individual, many of you are society. So there is an interaction here between what the individual thinks and what society as a whole is considering. And this is what is shown in this circle surrounding behavior. It's the attitudes and social norms that guide this interaction between the individual and society. For instance, if we have a strong social norm of flying is environmentally harmful, that will then also impact the consumer and the citizen. So what we need to do is to reinforce these social norms that then become attitudes that then again reinforce the social norms. That's a very important part for changing society, and then through society governance, because governance is always reactive. politicians will not do things that are good for the environment, but that the population is not willing to support. To the contrary, in aviation, we have many examples where the population is actually willing to support policies, but politicians will still not do it. So what we need is a very strong push from the population. That could be through flight shame, for instance, that then pushes government to introduce legislation, like in France, in my graph here, the headline on the lower right-hand side, where France then banned short-haul domestic flights because there was, pressure from the population to introduce policies in regard to climate change, and that then affects the whole system in terms of how tourism and aviation industry should be at the bottom here, how the aviation industry is then forced to adopt new technologies. So I'm seeing essentially this whole process that we need to support as something that is consisting of different actors and of a process that reinforces each step in the process of becoming tougher on aviation policies, really, because by the end of the day, if the consumer is not doing it, but perhaps willing to support the policies, what we are stuck with is policy making, and that is in the next slide, because the idea that we had here was to look into different policies and what they can do. And I'll explain this. You have three different dimensions here of change that will affect the aviation transport system. It's transport demand change. You can influence the individual to behave differently, as I have just outlined. And then you have the technology change, which is very important, because obviously a question here is, should we have flight in the future or not? If you agree that flight should continue to exist, which unfortunately or not, most people in the world, I think, would support, then we need new propulsion technologies. And that means there has to be technology change. That also means we cannot have voluntary offsets as a way out, because that will not imply propulsion change. And then we need social norm change at the bottom to support the whole thing. And within this mix, you can now assess different policies in terms of their effectiveness. And this is shown by the rings here. You have different concentric rings, and the further outside of this, these circles, the policy is located, the more effective it will be in supporting net zero, the net zero transition in aviation. And as a further distinction here, we have three policy types. We have soft policies, which essentially are just appeals. We have market-based policies that would actually change the price structure. And then we have regulatory policies, which are including, for instance, the bans that we've seen. You just make it impossible to use short-haul flight. So I cannot go through all the policies that are depicted here, but I think it's quite useful in terms of understanding how different policies will work, how effective they will be, because we are discussing a lot of things that will have a very small effects on the system. And I think it's important to remember that just 1% of humanity is responsible for 50% of flights. We have to do something about the very frequent flyers, in other words. We also need to look into the propulsion change, the technology change, what will support that. For instance, a fuel quota. But the most important thing is probably that we have to reduce demand. And that will only happen if flying becomes more expensive. And that is a very important part of the puzzle, because at this point we should all have understood that whatever change we envision, the technology change will be costly, both in terms of the energy requirements, but also in terms of how much this will need in terms of technology infrastructure installation in order to work. And to illustrate this last point, I've one more slide in which we did look into the options for low carbon trajectories. You see here a post-COVID recovery, that's pink. Essentially, that's a little bit below what we would have had without the pandemic in terms of aviation growth. This is depicting emissions. And you can see there's a quite dramatic, steep, continued growth curve if nothing happens. Now, in our model, we looked into two mechanisms of reducing the emissions from aviation. And the first component of this is to introduce a carbon tax. This carbon tax is very, very significant. It starts with 100 euros per ton of carbon dioxide, and then it goes up to 800 euros per ton by 2050. So there's a very steep increase in this model. And then we also said, if we want to transition the sector within 30 years, that means that within each year, essentially, you need to replace 3% of the aviation fuel that is used with technology, with synthetic fuels in our model, because that's the only technology that is proven that could work. And you can see, yes, if you try to bring that together, then there is theoretically really an opportunity here to make aviation at least net zero carbon, but not net zero radiative forcing, obviously. But at least something could happen. The caveat is, as already has been outlined by Finlay, the amount of electricity, of renewable energies that will be required for this transition is enormous. If you tell most people that you have to build 6,000 square kilometers of solar in order to make this transition happen per year, then unfortunately, most people seem to think, oh yeah, let's do it. But they've never considered what kind of challenge that will be. You can't just build 6,000 square kilometers of solar per year without very, very major implications for the world economy and in terms of how much it takes. And I think I should illustrate this. Next year, a synthetic fuel power station will go online that is supposed or expected to produce 10 tons of synthetic oil. It's actually crude that is produced and that has to be refined. But it's this newest and biggest plant for the production of synfuels is expected to produce 10 tons of fuel per day. It needs 10 megawatts of electricity as input to produce that amount of synthetic fuel. If you translate that, it means that in order to fly 10 to 15 larger aircraft, you will need the equivalent of one nuclear power station. And seriously, is that something that is realistic with 25,000 aircraft that we have at the moment? And I'm highly skeptical that these models can work. There's not even an initial understanding of the challenge that is ahead and how much has to happen within very short time frames in order to really restructure the system. So I'm unfortunately, with the policy environment that we have, at a very skeptical point at this time, where we have a lot of debates for the first time, but very limited options without radically increasing the cost of flying, because we talk a lot about market-based instruments, but market-based instruments only function if there's a market, and I just can't see that. So the proposition here to end my presentation is we need so much more in order to make it to design a sustainable aviation system that we are seeing at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for this insight into why those plans are probably not realistic and we need much stricter rules for the aviation industry. Now we had a very broad view on different aspects of the industry's growth plans and at many points unrealistic scenarios to decarbonize aviation. And before we go into some questions from the audience, I've seen that there was already some comments in this chat and some disagreement or questioning of market-based solutions in general and carbon pricing. So maybe that's probably also something we can discuss long on, and we have been touching in our network's publications often. But for now, I would like to stay for a little bit within our panel's within our panelists group and look again on the initial topic of this webinar, the question of greenwashing. And as we started with a definition of greenwashing and this great framework and the different aspects, I want to ask to our panelists, I mean, you can also ask questions to each other if you want, but I would really like to ask you after those presentations you've seen and from your work, where do you see the most, or where can you see those problematic, misleading claims most, and where do you see it most dangerous? What industry or also governments are promoting in terms of decarbonization solutions?
Maybe I can start. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I think, I mean, since I've joined Tyndall, we've worked on various projects, and one of the projects that we worked on was actually on the airport national policy statement last month. And if anybody has read the appraisal document of the NPS, there's mention of sort of wider economic benefits as a result of demand growth in aviation. The truth of the matter is COVID-19 has changed the landscape and because consumer behavior of flying. And there is a chance that it can actually, is here to stay. The consumer demand that, the UK government sort of alludes to is often by business, flight due to business. And the thing is that we've changed the way that we conduct business altogether in the COVID-19 pandemic. So the demand actually may never go up. So this sort of wider economic benefits that gets quoted a lot actually doesn't really consider the net benefits. It's only just the absolute benefits from, trade and investment that may or may not happen. So these are really big hypotheticals, and based off of that, we've seen cases being made for airport expansion. And so that's what we were trying to fight in that particular case. And so that's probably the more troubling, even from even if you sort of remove the environmental aspect of it, which you cannot, but even looking at it from an economic standpoint, it absolutely makes no sense to sort of go ahead with that. So that's probably one of the things that I came across in the UK context that really troubled me.
Thank you. Tone, do you want to maybe continue with a short with your point of view?
Yeah, there was a lot of input here. I was trying to think along the way how this would relate to this framework that we have developed of the 14 different categories. And it seems to me that really quite a lot of the claims made by the airport industry or the air industry or and the policy and the claims are very much linked to the very first topic that we presented about selective disclosure, because there are actually two main topics that fall under this heading, which is that there is a focus on efficiency all the time, instead of looking at the full life cycle of the product. So I think this was quite clear in what Finley showed, that if you look at the full life cycle, this is really impossible, and to not look at the total impact of the activities of the companies, and instead looking at efficiency. I mean, this completely falls under that kind of theme of selective disclosure. And maybe also a bit of political spin that there are lobbying going on at the same time pretending to be green, although we didn't discuss that too much. But quite a lot of the things that we have identified in the greenwashing framework are maybe, of kind of a kinder or more innocent sort than the airline industry, or this industry is really quite concentrated on a few of those aspects.
Yeah, but I think at some points we can see also like really the lies that it's actually false claims that are being made.
Can I just jump in here and really quickly? I also wanted to mention that, you know, when we are setting up offset projects, and this is also just goes beyond CORSIA, I'm just talking about voluntary offset market in general, we create sort of a supply chain. And if the existing supply chain is having negative impacts and there's no way to mitigate those negative impacts, CORSIA kind of just multiplies that impact, right? Because we're not currently looking at addressing those. We're just kind of making sure that we address surface level issues with regards to voluntary offset markets. And, you know, the voluntary market wasn't invented when we started discussing CORSIA. It's present, you know, it's going to be present after CORSIA. It was present before that. So there are existing issues there in terms of the supply chain of a specific offset project that we need to address as well. And it'd be interesting to see the framework being applied to ECO, and, you know, any sort of like third-party verification, sort of doing that kind of assessment would create very interesting results. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I was going to ask you, Stefan, whether you think this framework and the different parts would make sense also to assess the government claims and the government plans and measures and policy ideas to reduce the impact of aviation, whether you think it makes sense to go into that here.
Well, I think the political problem at this point is that most still consider aviation as something that's to be dealt with at a global level, which means there's still a lot of trust in CORSIA, which we have now. We have a long critique in the paper I presented on policy, so you can look that up if you want to. But the best countering argument to CORSIA is perhaps someone in Norway proposed that in order to make flying more environmentally friendly, it would be great if people not just purchase the offset, but 2 times the offset, because that would really make aviation more sustainable, right? And then a colleague said, oh, that's great, because that means the more we fly, the better it is for the climate. So there is your mental dead end, because it's just systemically not possible to use offsets. Having said that, to return to the policy issue, I can't fathom why it's so difficult to get policymakers to hop on board the national train. We need to do something about aviation emissions nationally, and then to also devise different policies. It doesn't really matter which ones. The main thing is that we move forward, so that there's different sets of policies that we can compare in terms of their operationality. And nobody's doing that. And I wonder why. And the only thing I can think of is because policymakers all too often are enmeshed in the problem. They like to fly. They are sort of buddies with industry. They get the greenwashing discourses. And the other thing is they know touching this issue is not a good thing. I mean, the Greens lost a significant share of their vote in Germany just simply because they proposed that short-haul flights should be banned. People don't like things being, punished or banned or taxed, and that is a major problem. And in all honesty, the greenwashing is a problem, but it's only just appealing to those people already flying anyway, which is just 1/3 of the population in the industrialized world. So I'm not thinking it has these repercussions that we seem to think for the rest of us who are more critical, but it might have repercussions for politicians. And that is really the area I wish we would focus on more, because it all hinges on politics, and we're losing trust in government at the moment, also because of COVID. And that is a very unlucky, unfortunate combination of well, it's a perfect storm really to resolving this problem.
Thank you, Stefan, for this comment. Is there any other from the panelists who would like to say something on this? Otherwise, I would like to open the questioning for our audience also. There were already some questions in the chat, but yeah, Ines, please.
Yes, Ines. Yes, I'm sorry, Anne. If it's okay,
please.
I would like to mention some comments. Only 2 comments. For once, the part about offset credits, if it's an option for to cover all of those damage. The system, how it's reached right now, it is oriented to compensate to those people that they're proposing all of this greenwashing. For example, greenwashing is only financing fake solutions. It is also important to be careful about proposals about reducing offset programs and also flights. And find solution that doesn't necessarily demand fossil fuel extraction. For example, a small continent with a lot with public transportation. In my case, I only know South America. We have large distance. We don't have public transportation. And there's are even territories that shouldn't be touched. For example, the Amazons. For example, the Amazons. You can only transit around the Amazon on air. But I think it is important to take it into consideration as other members of the panels that it is very different to think and analyze about compensations and reducing consumerism. It is important to align the different solution to each scenario.
Thanks a lot, Ines, for this important comment on why offsets are highly problematic. I want to give the word to the audience to ask some last questions before we close this webinar, and I've seen some questions in the chat already. I think some of them were answered, but I'd like to take out this question of, is greenwashing punishable by law? And I think we had an answer already here saying some kinds of greenwashing is not allowed. Example, misleading Ryanair adverts that have been banned after company it claimed it has the lowest carbon emissions of any major airline. And I mentioned some other examples before. They are also listed in one of our recent blog posts. And I think that could be one of the interesting ways also to address greenwashing, to actually look at how can we ban adverts for promoting those green solutions, or putting industry in a way that they can claim environmental friendly flying for themselves, because it's actually not true. So I think this is one solution. And I mean, Stefan, you said that maybe the greenwashing is not that interesting because it appeals only to those who are flying. But I think the problem of it is that the industry itself, by that, is put as someone contributing to solving of the problem, and that's actually but actually the opposite is happening, that they're not contributing but just doing as if they're contributing. So I think in the general public opinion, I think that's a very important point also to then get towards support for policy changes. Or I don't know if I misunderstood you, maybe. But
actually 10 years no, it's not 10 years ago, it's 8 years ago, I think, I reported Scandinavian Airlines for misleading marketing to the authorities. It was a long time before we started to talk about greenwashing, and it never went anywhere, which is really strange. It was, shifted between organizations that were supposed to deal with this. This is Sweden, one of the most democratic countries in the world, and nothing ever happened. So I'm definitely thinking this is important also in terms of we cannot let them off the hook. Also in terms of it shouldn't be made easier for anyone to believe that things are going in the right direction. You're definitely on track. I'm not saying this is not an important topic. I'm just saying people usually tend to believe what they already believe that they do know, and whatever kind of contradictory information they get is pushed aside. So this is a complex field, but no, I'm with you.
Thank you, Tone.
Yeah, it fits exactly to what Stefan just said, because I think in terms of flying, it seems to me that it's actually quite an exceptional field in one way, because there are so many environmentalists who get even captured by this greenwashing. It's really an area where people wish they do not have to make a change in their life. And then, so you have like green politicians in Norway. I'm from Norway originally, promoting hydrogen fuels and synthetic fuels and electric planes, because really they just want to find good arguments for it, even though it's not really their line of policy. But I just wanted to point to another aspect of what you said earlier, Stefan, about whether it doesn't have repercussions, greenwashing might not have repercussions, at least in a bigger picture, if we don't only look at flying as well now. I think this tendency that everything is constantly promoted as green and with green images and green colors and, really does not do anything good also to the part of the public which are maybe not conscious, but at least it takes everyone in the opposite direction because everything's promoted as green. So it had some kind of indirect effect even on the not so conscious group, I would think.
Thank you very much for this comment, Tone. There was another very technical question, or another question on the biofuels, and Stuart asked, what role do you see for algae as biofuels? I don't know, maybe Ines or Finlay want to answer that, or Gary?
Sorry, I was just answering another question. What was the biofuels question?
What chance, what potential you see for algae?
Yeah, I mean, so I would refer people to Biofuelwatch, the organization Gary's from, and his colleague Almuth there's quite a few reports on their page looking at the history of algae, because people have been saying this is around the corner for 15 or more years. And there's on their website, lots of examples of these pilots where, like, I think ExxonMobil put hundreds of millions into it and then they've stopped doing it. And it's one of these things you keep on in the news every few years. They say, we're going to do it again. This great promise. And it never happens. And part of the problem, as I understand it, is it's just actually quite an inefficient way to turn sunlight into energy rather than just using solar. You end up needing fresh water or particular water, and you end up actually needing quite a lot of land for it, or putting it somewhere in the ocean that's difficult to do. And there's just a lot of technical challenges that have never been overcome. So we've never seen a commercially viable plant. So it's one of these things where, like, if the industry wants you to believe that that's possible, they need to demonstrate it and show it. And until that point, we can't put any reliance on it. And I'd really make the point, if there's some area that you could grow some algae in, you need to make a good argument for not putting solar there, because solar is more efficient. And then if you've got solar energy, you need to look at an efficient use of that solar energy. Should we be making fertilizer for agriculture to feed people, or wasting loads of it to make jet fuel, is the thing we need to look at.
Thanks, Finlay. Okay, if there are no other main questions coming up, I saw there was another comment from Sarah introducing their green claims code in the chat. That sounds very interesting. Then I would sum up here, and yeah, I think we tried a very broad view on all the different aspects of greenwashing aviation, or on all the different questions that come up when the industry and lobbied governments are trying to find pathways for decarbonizing aviation and coming up with a lot of different possibilities that in the end, when we look at them, turn out to be a lot less promising than you think in the beginning, and have a lot of loopholes, shortfalls, and often even lies in there. So I think it's very important to look behind those green curtains, and also look at what are the main problems in there. In the fact sheets, we try to identify like what are the most often used claims, and many of the proposed solutions in the official communication always seem very soon to be realized. And this, in our analysis, we find that this is actually not true. But most of those, most of the solutions can, if they will ever come, only come too late for a meaningful contribution to the reduction that we need now. And I think I want to add one more thing that already came up in various inputs now, that is this question of paying, polluters paying. We had some discussion about this in the chat. And I think one important thing that we identified when looking at the proposed technical solutions is that the industry is always asking for subsidies for those technical improvements. And if we look at that, then we see again this unfairness, because we should not really put state money, like taxpayers' money, into developing those solutions for a minority, as we heard before, that is flying, while actually we could also put this government money into improving daily mobility for everyone, which is much cheaper, much more effective, and contributing much more to the mobility of everyone. So I think this is one of those things we should have our eye on when taxpayers' money is asked for developing those solutions. And the other thing that I want to state is that, though, as I said before, we would probably not say that we shouldn't develop any new technologies, but we must really take care that it doesn't distract us from the need to reduce aviation, to reduce the demand in different ways, but also to find policies that actually limit aviation. And I mean, Stefan made clear that it's not that easy to get to those policies, because there will be resistance. But I think that's also part of our civil society, of our tasks to demand this, and to keep on demanding this and changing the mindset of people, that we need those limits, and that we need, in case we need taxes, that we need taxes that are taxing, for example, frequent flyers first, to have this this justice aspect in there, and not just not just the money regulation aspect in there. So I know it is a very broad topic, and we could scratch only on the surface of many of those different aspects, but I still hope that it was interesting for you. And I want to thank all our speakers a lot for giving their time and their inputs here, and also many thanks to our interpreters for their great job to making this this webinar more accessible, also for people, for Spanish-speaking people. And many thanks to all of you for joining. And we would be very happy to get your feedback in our feedback form. If you have any comments on this webinar, any notes, then we'll be happy to hear from you. And apart from that, as Finlay said, have a look at our fact sheets, and also you might want to have a look at our campaign against greenwashing, our petition that asks policymakers not to fall for those false claims of the industry. So I'll be closing this webinar now, and thank you very much for your participation.